Welcome. On behalf of the Holder Initiative, I'm Elizabeth Manchester, the Associate Director, and we are delighted to welcome you to this evening's conversation on reparations. We are extremely thankful to the luminaries in this field who have agreed to join us this evening. And we are especially grateful to our wonderful moderator and organizer of this panel, Sydni Scott, Columbia College class of 2022. She is the founding director of the Amendment Project, a student-led organization that focuses on educating and encouraging students to get involved in the reparations movement across the country. She is an accomplished scholar and athlete, also a Rhodes Scholar-elect. And I have had the great privilege of getting to know her these past few years as a student advisory board member for the Holder Initiative. She's done excellent work, and we're just so delighted to have her here and have her moderating this panel this evening. Just a little bit about the Holder Initiative. When it was started a few years ago, it was the brainwave of Eric Holder and Dean James Valentini. And their vision in creating this was that they wanted the Holder Initiative to be a place where students could take the tools that they acquire through the core curriculum and put them into action as they explore and advocate for a more just society and for civil rights. And while I admit that I do tend to exaggerate, I don't think it's an exaggeration that Sydni really is the realization of this vision, and we are so pleased to have her here. And with that, Sydni, I will hand it over to you to introduce our amazing panelists.
Thank you so much, Beth. I'm so excited to welcome you all to the first part of our panel series on reparations. And I know we got started a little late, so we will just go ahead and jump right in. Tonight, we are joined by three scholars and practitioners who are going to engage in a really exciting conversation about reparations. So our first panelist tonight is Dr. Linda Mann. She is the co-founder of the African American Redress Network, a collaboration between Columbia University, Columbia University's Institute for the Study of Human Rights, and Howard University's Thurgood Marshall Center. Her research and practice focus on the intersection of U.S. history, human rights, and reparations. She previously served as the executive director for the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project at Northeastern University School of Law and the vice president of the research for the Georgetown Memory Project, where she founded and directed the GU 272 Descendant Oral History Initiative. Dr. Mann is a seasoned educator with over 10 years of postgraduate teaching experience, 10 years as a public school history teacher, and she started her career as a conflict resolution specialist and now has decades of experience as a political grassroots organizer. So I know we're on a webinar format, but silently, please welcome Dr. Mann. Up next, we are joined by Professor Katherine Franke, who is the James L. Dohr Professor of Law at Columbia University, where she also directs the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law and is the founder and faculty director of the Law, Rights, and Religion Project, a think tank based at Columbia Law School that develops policy and thought leadership on the complex ways in which religious liberty rights interact with other fundamental rights. In 2021, Professor Franke launched the ERA Project, a law and policy think tank to develop academically rigorous research policy papers, expert guidance, and strategic leadership on the Equal Rights Amendment. Her most recent book, Repair, Redeeming the Promise of Abolition, makes the case for racial reparations today by telling the story of experiments in South Carolina and Mississippi in the 1860s, where freed people were given land explicitly as reparations for enslavement and then had it taken away by the government. Before coming to the law school, Professor Franke was an associate professor of law at Fordham Law School and the University of Arizona College of Law. She is currently leading a team that is researching Columbia Law School's relationship to slavery and its legacies. Finally, I'm going to introduce Professor Justin Hansford. He is the Howard University School of Law Professor of Law and Executive Director at the Thurgood Marshall Center. Professor Hansford was previously a Democracy Project Fellow at Harvard University, a visiting professor of law at Georgetown University, and an associate professor of law at St. Louis University. He also earned a Fulbright Scholar Award to study the legal career of Nelson Mandela and served as a clerk for Judge Damon J. Keith on the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. He is a leading scholar and activist in the areas of critical race theory, human rights, and law and social movements. And he is a co-author of the forthcoming 7th edition of Race, Racism, and American Law, the celebrated legal textbook that was first casebook published specifically for teaching race-related law courses. His interdisciplinary scholarship has appeared in academic journals at various universities, including Harvard, Georgetown, Fordham, and the University of California at Hastings. And he is also a member of the Stanford Medicine Commission on Justice and Equity. So now that we've introduced our panelists, I am so excited to get started. So we'll just go right ahead. And I'm going to direct the first question at Professor Hansford. So in 2020, Evanston, Illinois became the first city to pass a municipal-wide reparations bill, and the resolution has been venerated as a historic step in the movement for racial justice. However, at the same time, several nonprofit and legal aid organizations have pled to sue the city of Evanston. The organizations claim that race-conscious distribution of government funds is unconstitutional and even racial discrimination. In your work, how do you contend with these kinds of objections?
Great. Well, actually, I wanted to start out really quickly by saying thank you so much for inviting me here this evening. I am very honored to have been in community with people like Linda Mann and, of course, Katherine Franke, longtime chair of the board for the Center for Constitutional Rights, my political home. And I think that I'm already part of the Columbia Reparations family because we are connected through the African American Redress Network, and I'm so plugged into Katherine Franke's work. So thank you so much for bringing it all together sort of full circle today. One of the things that I'm most proud of in terms of our coalition with Columbia University has been our work to help support the effort in Evanston. For those who don't know, Evanston has passed a local initiative designed to provide reparations for the history of redlining that took place in the city of Evanston, Evanston being a suburb of Chicago. From 1919 to 1969, the city of Evanston actually engaged in its own research, published its own very thorough economic study demonstrating the continued disproportionate economic impact of that redlining project, and asserting that they intended to provide a project that would allow repair to the tune of a few $1 million for a number of people who were descendants of those who were impacted by that history. Now, this ongoing debate around reparations has many different facets. I know we're going to be talking about different facets this evening. To a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and for me, the lawyer, everything looks like a legal issue. The issue that many people have continued to debate is whether or not reparations is even constitutional. The common knowledge, the common assumption over time is actually maybe no, because under the 14th Amendment, for those of you who have studied critical race theory, you know this, we have a 14th Amendment equal justice under law doctrine, conception that says that our goal is to avoid any sort of discrimination on the basis of race, not very clearly articulating how sometimes you need to make decisions and provide benefits on the basis of race to remedy past decisions on the basis of race that were that were designed to harm some more than others. There's a Supreme Court case that dealt with this in the context of government contracts in the early 90s called Arlington Heights. I don't want to get into the details of it, but essentially this is a debate I had with another prominent reparations scholar, Charles Darity, where this question around whether or not reparations is constitutional is actually easier to answer when you have projects like Evanston on the local level, where you can very precisely demonstrate the history of harm for particular individuals and particular people and particular families, and very specific evidence of that the program that is designed for repair is, the term we use is narrowly tailored to remedy the specific harm that was done by the state. The case is City of Richmond versus Crossan, actually a 1986 case. And the upshot of that has been that societal discrimination, the broader history of race in America is not sufficient basis for affirmative action. It's not sufficient basis for affirmative action in education or government contracting. You have to have very narrowly tailored evidence, very specific evidence of particular harms. On the local, so my debate with Charles Darity, I'm gonna go back to that right now. He is someone who advocates for reparations to happen only on the federal level with the passage of HR 40 and not on the local level. But my argument with him is that on the local level, it is easier to do the research to demonstrate the specific, very precise harms that the city engaged in, like the redlining activity, which took place in the city of Evanston. So that with that specific evidence, it's easier to make the argument that you can clear the 14th Amendment hurdle so that you can indeed find these reparations programs to be constitutional. Now, Evanston in many senses is a test case. It's the first case of its kind in recent memory. It's now possibly going to be imitated by other cities around the country, I think over a dozen or maybe up to 20 cities, Linda. Other cities around the country, I mean, up to maybe 20 cities around the country are going to imitate Evanston. So if Evanston's model holds up in court and is deemed to be constitutional, my belief is that it is our best chance for reparations. Because number one, it's the most constitutional, and number two, another point I want to raise is that it's the most pragmatic. Because let's be honest, there are cities that are majority minority cities, cities that are very progressive cities, cities with really, really progressive mayors that are going to be much quicker to pass reparations ordinances or laws than the federal government will, as long as we have this split that we have with Republican and Democratic Party. Some members of that Republican Party, I mean, I won't go into depth on that, but it's very clear that you're going to have an easier time in cities like St. Louis or Philadelphia or Los Angeles and California, as opposed to waiting on the federal government. So I think politically and legally, the case for local reparations is a very strong case. And I'm very excited to be working with Linda at the African American Redress Network to continue to develop that case and support those organizers on the ground who are leading the way in making it happen. They're actually making the change. And as a movement lawyer, I see my role as trying to be a sort of a backstop support for the change that they are leading.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So when we think about this concept of narrowly tailoring, and then we look sort of more broadly in the context of the United States, chattel slavery, racial segregation, mass incarceration, these things have disproportionately impacted Black Americans and produced really profound socioeconomic inequalities. And these inequalities inform contemporary debates about reparations. And so my next question is for Professor Franke. What kinds of demands does the racial history of the United States make on us today? And how does that history justify reparations?
Thank you, Sydney. It's a great question. And I want to thank you and the Holder Center for inviting us. I know we planned this event, was it like 8 years ago? But it felt like about a while ago, and COVID kept us from coming together. So I'm glad we finally are. I just want to say one thing before I talk about history, which is it is history. I was born in Evanston Hospital and grew up in Evanston, and in a house with a racially restrictive covenant attached to the house. And my parents couldn't buy a house in a Black neighborhood, nor could Black folks buy a house in my neighborhood. And in my public school, there was one Black boy who was my friend, and but was an extremely racially segregated neighborhood. I actually don't know how he ended up in our elementary school, given how pervasive the racial segregation was in Evanston. So I feel what's happening there very personally, both as my own experience as a kid growing up and as an adult engaging in reparations work of thinking about what's my role in this. So in terms of the historical work I've done, but the work that we all are doing in understanding how the history of enslavement and more broadly, the history of white supremacy, which has structured American law and society from before the founding, how kind of pulls on us today. What kind of moral demands does it make on us today? And I think one of the ways to answer that question is to think about how the relegation of the institution of slavery or the history of slavery or the horror of slavery to the past and locking it up there, that this is something that was bad, that many would agree, unfortunately not all, would agree was bad, but that it doesn't relate to today in any meaningful way. And we've heard this from members of Congress, certainly from many people of the public, that it's part of an old story of the United States that is no longer contemporarily relevant. What does it do in protecting and perpetuating white innocence? David, the theorist, David Scott has written a lot about disowned pasts and what we ought to do with those disowned pasts when they get locked into the history in a way where there's never been a public or a private reckoning. And part of what I try to do in Repair is connect that history to today, of understanding how the intergenerational, not just economic effects, but I think really in every way effects of the institution of slavery and how it was inadequately and only partially actually abolished is something we still live with today. And so the history that I have looked at in the Sea Islands and just outside Vicksburg, Mississippi, illustrate a kind of history where enslaved people were emancipated into a second-class form of freedom. As I describe it, they were freed, but they were never free. And the kinds of material resources that were necessary for them to live real free lives upon emancipation were never given to them in any sustainable way, such that they were locked into a kind of state of second or third class peasantry that has passed from generation to generation and that we're still living with today in terms of the second class legal status of Black people in so many ways. And I think that's exactly what Justin was just describing in terms of the incapacity of the Equal Protection Clause to even imagine what it would mean to remediate structural race discrimination, but also the racial wage gap, the racial wealth gap. All of those, I think, are not just contemporary problems that don't have any sort of historical relevance, but are directly related to the ways in which Black people were emancipated into a second-class status. And so that history calls me, and I hope it calls all of us to think about that difference between being freed and being free, and what it would mean to face that history in an uncomfortable way, particularly as white people, with a willingness to surrender some of the resources that we have that I believe are the ill-got gains of the wages of whiteness.
I think it's really interesting that you brought up this concept of historicity and how Black people were sort of freed into this preordained status. And I'm definitely going to follow up with you about your book, but I'll direct this next question to Dr. Mann. So we at the Amendment Project, we do some high school workshops. And so we go into high schools and we have conversations with high school students about reparations. And recently this past year, we had a workshop with a school in Brooklyn, and we did a sort of case study where we went through the 6 tenets of reparations, which is cessation of harm, guarantees of non-repetition, rehabilitation, compensation, restitution, and satisfaction. And we looked at the case study of Seneca Village, which was essentially a primarily African-American neighborhood of property owners pre-Civil War that was essentially demolished in order to make room for the construction of Central Park. And in our conversations about this, the students brought up questions about, how to foreground questions of, political disenfranchisement that came after people, were compensated in some way for their land, but weren't property owners anymore and therefore weren't able to vote. But also things like the loss of entrepreneurial small businesses and, the lack of accessibility to childcare without community support and the need for mental health resources. And others even brought up, the relocation of a majority Black community to areas with more climate hazards. And so when we think about these things existing in our past, and sort of contending with the ramifications of how they reperpetuate into the future, especially across all of these different institutions and all of these different facets of life. Is it possible, do you think, and sort of can you speak to how we can conceptualize thinking about a comprehensive idea of reparative policy that not only supplies compensation, but addresses these compounding impacts?
Great question, Sydney. And I too want to thank you for hosting this evening. And it's wonderful to be on the panel with Professor Hansford and Professor Franke. I am the lone non-lawyer in the group. And so I really appreciate this question because it's something that I've thought about deeply with our work. And one of the things that I wanted to say about this is that, with the Seneca Village, you talked about them getting some kind of financial recompense for the wrongdoings. And I think in the US, that's immediately what people think, right? The first thing that people think is reparations, and they're going to receive some type of money. But, I think there's been across the world acknowledgement that money alone does not repair historical injustices. And so if we wanted to just look at a US example of that, a perfect example of that would be the 1980 Supreme Court case, which was the Sioux versus, it was the United States versus Sioux Nation of Indians, in which there was reparations passed. They were given, I think, somewhere around $17 million in the 1980s, and to this day have refused to take the money. Why? Because it wasn't the money that they wanted that would provide justice or reparative justice to them. They wanted the land. The land had sacred meaning to them, still has sacred meaning to them. And if I'm correct to today, that money is worth billions. So how do you attend to those, compounding effects you're talking about? And for me, and for our work that we do, we look at the international human rights framework. Now, we could talk a little bit about the US obligation and how we, interact with the International Convention of Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination and the various other treaties of the UN. But this framework gives us, as you were just mentioning, these categories of reparations: restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, guarantees of non-repetition. And although it doesn't clearly define, right, the UN hasn't clearly defined what gross and serious violations, there's kind of an agreement that these are any violations that went against human rights, and those include right to life, and as I just mentioned, racial discrimination. So I think what we're seeing within the US is this playing out in the field of racial reparations at the micro and meso level. And who knows if the macro at some point will occur. But at the community level, for instance, and I'll give you a couple of examples I thought about with this question, is that if you look at the descendants of Elaine, Arkansas, that was one of the massacres of the Red Summer. There were about 26 cities across the country that experienced significant racial violence and terror. Of course, one of the most well-known is Tulsa, which was, also referred to as Black Wall Street, in which there was actually a discharge of US military personnel to back these efforts of racial terror. And I don't want to get too focused on this, but I can't help but thinking, as I'm watching what's unfolding in Ukraine, and thinking about, here you have your own military coming in and desecrating your community and your families. So in that instance, and also in Elaine, Arkansas, you're seeing these communities fighting for reparations across all of these categories. So it's not only having acknowledgement, which is part of satisfaction, right? It's looking for compensation, of course, money, but it's also looking for ways to rehabilitate. One of the things that happened this past year in Elaine, and it didn't get through, but there was state legislation put through to actually have basically racial healing circles in every county throughout Arkansas to gather together people of color, white, old, young, to sit and to actually have these racial healing centers. It didn't pass, but it was brought up, because there is a need to attend to things other than just the monies. I think at the municipal level, we're seeing this happen. We're seeing this happening in cities that are beginning to look at this. Now in Evanston, of course, that decision was made to focus specifically on housing policies and practices and to look at ways to repair the historical injustice of Evanston in the ways in which they enacted discriminatory housing policies. But if you were talking to former Alderman Robin Rue Simmons, she would tell you that they held significant community gatherings. They talked across the community, and there were a zillion of different things that they thought about that needed to be remedied, including education. And so actually now that the housing is implemented, they are beginning to look at implementing a school, a magnet school in Evanston, to help remedy some of the harms that have reverberated in other economic vectors. You can't have a city or a community endure these kinds of racially motivated terrors or policies and practices that basically took away their economic well-being and think that it's not going to reverberate into every single solitary category. And so I would just say that, comprehensively, we're seeing other cities. San Francisco, I'd raise up. San Francisco has a very comprehensive reparation program going on right now. They're looking at economics, they're looking at education, they're looking at health, housing, criminal system. And so I really believe, as Justin was saying, that we are going to be seeing cities and communities tackling these from within those types of 5 categories within the human rights framework to really do what I would like to call wraparound reparations that are comprehensive and truly work to heal a community.
I really appreciate your bringing up all of these, this sort of idea of comprehensive and all of the different factors that can entail, because, I know for me personally, when I would hear about the concept of reparations, in the first few years of college before that, I sort of understood it as this, write a check and sort of that's the end of the day. And so I think it's really valuable and necessary to include all of these different factors. I remember we talked about a discussion about reparations, or reparative justice taking the form of commuting the sentences of people who were falsely convicted and providing them with resources to pursue education and to pursue work opportunities and to pursue mental health resources. And so when we think about all of these, broad factors, getting more into, I guess, the concrete, what are some of the challenges that you've encountered in your work with the African American Redress Network in essentially trying to bridge the gap between theoretical frameworks of redress and practical implementation of reparative projects? And I'm going to shoot that one back at Dr. Mann before we head back up the list.
I get double duty. It's a great question. So I'm actually going to go back to my initial training in the field, and I'm going to talk about a couple of scholars that were really influential for me. So the first one actually that I'm going to talk about is Eric K. Yamamoto. He's a professor of law and social justice at the University of Hawaii, Manoy. He's internationally recognized for his work on racial justice and racial reconciliation. And in 1997, he wrote a piece about critical race theory and what he termed critical race praxis. And in that article, and I literally, it reverberated in my head when I read it, he talks about the fact that critical race theorists face, and I'm going to quote, an apparent performative contradiction, employing theoretical tools that deny law's authenticity while seeking to remake law practically so that it performs for the end of racial justice. And he develops this critical race praxis in this journal article that he writes about, talks about actually working in communities and how we can develop. He semi calls it restorative justice. He doesn't actually use the term reparations in the article, but talks about how critical race theory can be used in a performative manner with these guideposts that he sets out. And his work alongside Masuda was incredibly powerful for me. So Masuda, of course, talks a lot about the victim of racial oppression having a very distinctive insight and the use of counter storytelling. And those two, combined with my work in oral history, led me to the realization that communities have to be at the forefront of this work. And the voices of communities must be at the forefront of this work. So when I first began working in the space, it's like, well, so how do we do that? Right? I mean, that is not a small question. And I remember reading Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy. And at the very end of one of his chapters, about 3/4 into the book, he makes this comment about proximity. And he says, if we do not have proximity, we can make up narratives about the other. And that just struck a chord. Like, we have to have proximity. So how do you do that in a university? We're honestly, like, at Columbia, we're inside gates. And it's really hard. Like, we're busy in our books and we're studying. And so how do you merge those two? And that was really the challenge for us with the African American Redress Network. For those of you who don't know, we collaborate with Professor Hansford, and we formed a collaboration. And the first thing we did, and it seems like such a small thing, but we started just mapping and using a very systematic research and ArcGIS to start mapping these local level efforts to attend to historical injustices. And we mapped out over 470 incidences across the country. And then we started reaching out to them saying, hey, we've identified you as a reparation effort. We would love to engage with you. And for many, that opened up the door. I mean, that began conversations that I'd never had in my office reading theory, and began engaging with communities. And one thing I will say is that, we use a lot of what is available, not only through peer-reviewed journal articles and Google and such to identify this, but one of our recent projects has been creating a coalition. We did a pilot coalition in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And one of the other things that's come to my realization with this is that we actually don't know how many local communities are doing this. There are many who don't make the media, or who are also haven't been engaged with universities. And so there isn't anything written out them. There are many, many communities that are working at local reparations. I want to say, in response to this question before my time is up, is that to me then, so we've identified communities, but really the core of the question is, what is the utility of our work? Right? What is the utility of a university? What is the utility of a professor? What is the utility of research? And for me, thinking back to Yamamoto, thinking back to Masuda, it's being deeply embedded in the communities. It's listening to these histories of injustice. It's figuring out how to use the tools we have within the university, within our research, to actually raise up and work collaboratively, co-collaborate with these communities as they are trying to secure racial justice and reparations. And I think the fact that we alone just mapped 470 plus is a strong statement that this country is in deep need of this racial healing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. That was a very genuinely incredible answer. I think it's really something important and interesting to think about, sort of how, I as a student that's interested in reparations, the people in the audience, what is our connection and touch point to this movement and to this process. And so I want to follow back up with Professor Franke. In your book, Repair, and also you mentioned it earlier, this distinction between being free and being freed. So when we sort of not only talk about reparations, but when we engage in reparations, as Professor Hansford mentioned, that these are, these projects are being mimicked around the country, and these are developing more in the way of reparative justice than we have sort of seen in throughout this very long history of pursuit of it. How does that distinction inform the need for reparative justice, and sort of how can we pay that, and how can we pay for reparations, and also ensure that as students, as scholars, as whoever else has joined us, that we are conscientious and sort of pursuing with efficacy reparations work, or at least reparations ideas.
Well, that's a lot. Your questions are so good. I think we're all feeling a bit overwhelmed by how penetrating they are. I will say that in my own view, and I think Dr. Mann and Professor Hansford share this view. It's not a one-off event. Reparations are not. It's just as racism and white supremacy is not an event, it's a structure. I think reparations are as well. And so it's an ongoing process that we're only really just meaningfully beginning. And that's why I would also disagree with Darity that it's something that would be a one-off event that would happen in Congress. While it's nice that the HR 40, or that the bills have moved further in Congress than they ever have before, I don't feel particularly hopeful of what that process will look like at the end. But the process itself of us talking about, having a national conversation about why are reparations even relevant, still have ongoing relevance, I think is incredibly important. And the work that Dr. Mann's doing is of thinking reparations complexly, locally, in terms of land, in terms of so many other things. And one of the things that's been so important for me is thinking of knowledge as being a kind of reparations. And so some of what I've done is gone back to the Sea Islands area, gone back to the Carolinas, gone back to Mississippi with the research I've done, and worked with high school kids for them to do research about their own families, how to do archival research, to learn about their own communities. I mean, first of all, it's fun. I think it's fun. Maybe that's just me, the history professor, that I think it's fun, but it's like a treasure hunt. And if once you've done archival research, it's hard to stop. And I see younger people getting so excited about learning the history that they're not taught. And this was before the huge conjured threat of critical race theory that we're experiencing now, but this was not taught even before that time. And so knowledge itself, I think, can be a form of reparations, as well as redistribution of land, writing checks, creating an infrastructure of disestablishing the afterlife of slavery, and then of course creating the mechanisms by which it will not repeat itself. So I'm trying to remember where your question was taking me to begin with. This is the third talk I've given today, so I apologize that I'm a little tired. But it's what drew me was this history and this way of thinking of how we bear this contemporary responsibility for this history, and that we have examples from the 1860s of what it would mean to meaningfully repair the institution of slavery and its horrors, as articulated by formerly enslaved people. They were asked by white military officers who were moving through the Sea Islands, through Mississippi, through Georgia, through Alabama, what is it you want now that you're free? Just for a moment, take that on board of what that must have been like for freed people. What do you want? To be asked by a white person, what do you want? And not surprisingly, they knew exactly what they wanted, which was land, where they had grown up, where their people were buried, what was home to them, where they spoke their language, that they knew how to farm. They wanted land, and they wanted white people to leave us alone. We need to build communities in which we can heal together, which we can build independent, economically independent, politically, legally independent lives and figure out for ourselves what freedom means rather than having you tell us. And for a few short years, that happened. There were these autonomous communities that were created. And then once Lincoln is assassinated, all of that land is taken back and returned to former enslavers. And for those of you who are law people, but even for those who aren't, what free people wanted was land, and what they ended up with was contract. They were forced to enter into year or more long contracts with the people who had formerly enslaved them. And that's what freedom looked like. And so that's to come back to this idea of being freed versus being free. And so today, how do we actually remediate in some meaningful way that second, third, fourth theft is which was what occurred in these experiments, really, really inspirational experiments in freedom. And I think one way to do that, to pay for it today, is through the estate tax. We are in the midst of the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth that we've ever seen in this planet. Quadrillions of dollars are passing from my parents' generation to my generation at the lowest inheritance tax rate that we've ever had in this country. It's a winning of a lottery for so many people. These are fortunes that are being passed down, large and medium and small fortunes that I think we have no legal, no political, certainly no moral entitlement to. And so much of those fortunes were amassed through land ownership that white people got, either, going back to the Homestead Act, where enormous amounts of land were given to white people to settle in the western part of this country, at the very point when Black people were saying, we want land to build free lives, and we're told, no, you can't have that land, but we're going to give Native Americans land away to white people in the western part of the country. And so wealth was developed there. And then, of course, all of the redlining, the mortgages, the race discrimination that has happened, government-sponsored and run race discrimination that has happened in the ways in which home ownership became the greatest engine of wealth accumulation in this country for white people in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So I like the idea of using the estate tax as a way to capture some of those those undeserved gains, and put them into a trust for the communities that Dr. Mann was describing, to discuss about what to do with it. And personally, I'm very fond of the idea of community land trusts as one of the things to do, not the only. But rather than thinking about enriching individual Black people with checks, I like to think about how to build power in communities, in addition to perhaps writing checks to individuals. So that's just a partial answer to your wonderful and complex question, Sydney.
And that was a fantastic answer. Honestly, I think, when we talk about reparations, again, it can sort of seem like this sort of unable to sort of capture onto what this might look like in practice. And so I really appreciate you being able to offer some ideas about what are the tangible and practical mechanics of how this system is being reperpetuated still today. And I also think it makes a great connection back to Dr. Mann's point about listening to communities and valuing what they say. Anybody who has not already read Professor Franke's book, I cannot recommend it more highly, because it really does get into the questions and the answers of what does it look like when we give agency to the communities of people that have been harmed by our government and by our country. I'd like to follow up now again with Professor Hansford. So having had this discussion about the United States and all of these systems in the United States and how they work and how we might be able to rectify them. I also know in 2019 you wrote an article about a hearing before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to towards the idea of learning from people and learning from history, how a human rights framework and potentially an international framework, how we can learn from that in our domestic conversation about reparations, and what reciprocity might exist between a global conversation about reparations and the one in the United States.
All right. Well, before I even say that, though, I have to say that in my own family history, on my father's side, the town of Princeville in Edgecombe County, North Carolina, the first incorporated town by formerly enslaved people in the United States, was founded by he's a great grandparent of mine, and that's one of our family legacies. And it was once called Freedom Hill, but then they incorporated it as Princeville in 1885. So it's just going back to that history is something that is a dream that many people in my family continue to talk about now, 100 plus years later. Is something we continue to take pride in, that idea that we had our own land and we were part of a community that built that independent, black owned town, so to speak. And even though it was right next to the river, so it had been subject to floods over the years and still is, it's still a point of pride over 100 and some odd years later. So that just goes to show you the power of what Professor Franke is arguing for. So I just definitely commend that. On this question of the international framework for reparations, Linda had talked about that very articulately. Not only have we seen it in some of the places where you would instinctively think about reparative programs taking place, like South Africa, after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process in the 90s, after apartheid, of course, Germany, and repair that's been provided for people who were victimized by the Holocaust. But even more so in Chile, and after Pinochet, and there's a very robust history of reparations being seen as part of a project of societal repair and remedy and healing for nations around the world. What took place in 2019 was it was a hearing at the Inter-American Commission, talking about an Inter-American Commission, I should mention, is I don't know how to describe it, maybe as a mini UN system dedicated specifically for the Western Hemisphere. Inter-American meaning the interaction between states in the Americas. And it also is a site where we can have conversations like this around human rights as it relates to the Americas. And what we were trying to do during that hearing was to involve the international community in beginning to share that knowledge gained from efforts around repair and reparation from other societies to help inform what we are hoping and expecting will take place here in the United States, and is already taking place, as Linda said, in over 470 cities and municipalities and smaller communities and universities and seminaries around the country. So I think that knowledge sharing process is one of the more exciting things that we can do. One of the newer opportunities I've had to be able to serve most recently has come out of my involvement in something called the Permanent Forum for People of African Descent at the United Nations. There's a permanent forum for Indigenous peoples that has been in operation for over 20 years and meets once a year at the United Nations. But in between then, they issue reports, they come together, they do site visits. It's about 16 scholars and activists from the Indigenous community who serve terms on that commission. We're hoping that this commission will be something similar, and we're hoping that reparations is right at the top of the list. And through that process, we're hoping to continue to bring these ideas from different parts of the world to bear to help us fashion effective reparations projects that may differ. Certainly the project will differ in the United States from the one in South Africa, from the one in Germany, from the one in Chile. What we're seeing, Linda, which is part of the argument for local community-led reparations initiatives, is that the project in Evanston will differ from the project in San Francisco, which will differ from the project in Asheville, which will differ from the project in Brown Grove. So that is okay, and that's good. And the project should be designed to provide healing for that particular community based on how they define repair and reparation themselves. So it's a very interesting dynamic because we went from local to national to international, with the idea ultimately to go back to local again, use that international lens to go back and inform the local discussion around reparations.
Thank you so much. Yes, that reciprocity of information and sharing, I think, is really incredible. So we have time for a couple of questions that we're going to open up to anybody who cares to answer. Professor Hansford, you just spoke to this human rights framework, and Dr. Mann, you talked about your work in these local communities, and Professor Franke, you gave us some concrete ideas about what this looks like in practice in connection to this history. And so when we think about not just racial injustice, but also reparations specifically, and this resurgence of interest and of legitimacy that we've seen attached to this movement, what do you think are some of the most critical developments that you've observed, at least, in the movement for reparations over the past couple of decades?
Well, I'll start. I think you have to say that the article by Ta-Nehisi Coates in I'm not sure was that 2014 or 2015? That was a game changer. That brought a great deal of legitimacy to the discussion that had not existed in previous decades in the mainstream. Being someone who was many of you may know this, he is the son of a publisher of a Black-owned press, who is also an activist himself, Paul Coates, who is currently working on reparations projects himself, including a campaign for the exoneration of Marcus Garvey, New Yorker, a New York activist, of course, who was convicted 100 years ago in New York for mail fraud. So that lineage was really relevant, I believe, to his decision to make the case for reparations, and to make that case not solely based on enslavement either, to make that case based on the history of redlining and things that took place in the 20th century. The significance of that being that so many people have such a hard time conceptualizing, providing remedy for harm that took place in their minds 2,000 years ago, even though, again, my grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. So my grandfather helped raise me, his grandfather was enslaved. So, but that article, I think, was a game changer. Then later on, you saw the discussion happening in Congress, and you saw the one way to track it is even to look at President Obama's discussion of it, and probably even A.G. Holder's discussion of it, which I haven't followed as closely, but it went from being a third rail issue to, on the way out of office, President Obama was very openly saying that we should consider something like a reparations project. And that was a change in the political winds that allowed for that type of statement to be made between 2008 and 2016. Just a huge shift in the discourse. And of course, the Black Lives Matter movement had something to do with that too. Just a little bit to do with that, but I think that was a sea change after that article, and I think we have to keep that in mind.
Thank you so much.
I would just to echo something that where Professor Hansford ended. There are these moments of I like to think of them as sort of social and political spark plugs, in moments where things kind of move ahead in ways that maybe you wouldn't have anticipated. And certainly Coates's article, I think, did that, generated a conversation, but it kind of petered off after a while. There was a big splash after that came out in the Atlantic, and then people went back to business as usual. I think many people, not in this audience, but many people thought that Obama's election was a form of reparations, and then we're done. Like, we got a Black president, what more do you want? But George Floyd's murder, I think, was a catalyst for a lot of people to really have to demand a reckoning with what wasn't an isolated event, obviously, but was a legacy of a kind of violence and inhumanity of Black people in this country, disposability of Black people in this country, that of course then motivated the Black Lives Matter movement. And it's that kind of political activism, unfortunately, generated often out of horrible tragedy, that then will push our elected officials and judges and elites to take this stuff seriously. And so it was Floyd's assassination or murder, followed by the activism and protests afterwards, that got people running for president to say the word reparations in their campaign materials, on the stage of debates. I was pretty surprised to see that it was not the Republicans, of course, but the Democrats knew they had to have a position on reparations, for better or for worse, and usually they were inadequate, but they were saying the word in a way that had never been said before. And so I think the energy that grew out of the horrible tragedy of Floyd's murder and the amazing activism that followed it was a real amazing impetus for us to start facing the ugliness of racial violence and this racial history in this country.
I'm hopeful that will continue, Professor Franke, that we'll continue to see efforts across the country. And, because we are engaging with so many different organizations, we see efforts cropping up all the time. To your point that you said before, it's a process, and it's not a one point particular occasion. It's going to be a long, long time. And so I hope what you were just saying also, Professor Hansford, with the awareness that came with Coates' work and kind of raising public education awareness, that there has been a sentiment change. And I do see that, like in the coalition building that we're doing in Virginia, we had a League of Women Voters start coming to the coalition meetings. They ended up doing a report on reparations. A group of predominantly white individuals who'd never ever thought about this before started investigating and doing research. Organizations like Coming to the Table, who hold racial healing circles. So, I'm thinking about an article that Brookings put out about like how many white people are in support of reparations, and it was only a small incremental change between, I think, like 2014 and 2020. But I'd like to believe that these forces that we're just talking about, that we're beginning to see a sea change of all citizens in the US become, at least not all citizens, we can't say that, but a good majority of the citizens beginning to be interested and intrigued and curious and wanting to understand more and delving a little bit into this history. And that public education piece that Professor Franke was talking about before is going to be the most important piece to that. It's going to be the most important piece of that. And I just want to put a shout out to Minnesota, because there is a group in Minnesota who has started a 3-tiered reparation process. It's through the Minnesota Council of Churches, but it's called Minnesota Racial Legacy, Finally Telling the Truth. The first year they're going across the state and they're having community dialogue, so truth commissions. The second year, they're going to be doing public education series. And the third year, they're going to be looking at reparations. So these are the kind of sea changes that I see that make me hopeful.
I mean, as a student who is, I'm only 22 years old, it has been really profoundly exciting to see the momentum of this conversation and of this movement build, even just over the past couple of years. So I really appreciate all of your insight. We're running a little bit out of time, but I just have one last question that we can't leave without answering. So I know it's a lot for a 30-second, 1-minute answer, but for the students in the audience today, for everyone in the audience, honestly, what advice would you like to offer them in terms of how they can focus on reparations and reparative justice in their work, in their lives? And that one as well goes to all three of you.
Well, volunteer for the African American Redress Network with Professor Linda Mann up there at Columbia University. She has done miracles with the volunteers that she has been able to organize and lead, and more the merrier. So that's the best way to help. Volunteer with Linda Mann.
I would say also to, besides definitely working with Dr. Mann, is seeing the places that are important to you, where you grew up, where you're going to school, where you may work, where you may live after school, as places where you can do reparative work as well. We should have acknowledged this at the beginning, although I joined a second late, so maybe you did, but we're here in New York on Lenape land, and that land was not given to us. It was seized and stolen. And so that kind of ethical relationship to the place and the institutions where we all are living and working and studying is hugely important. Columbia University has not really taken seriously its relationship to slavery. There is a lot that the research group that's been working at the university has done, but the administration has had a minimal connection to it, and that should change. We're doing this, I think, meaningful project at the law school that will be a model for other parts of the law school, but also other professional schools around the country, on how to take account of and face our own history. So it really is work that can be done and should be done everywhere. And so it could be small, it could be big, but it should be part of how you think about all the work that you do in the places you live.
I'm going to chime in and just say that Professor Hansford is going to get me in trouble with many more student volunteers, but I would be remiss if I did not raise everyone up, both from Howard University and Columbia University and the students that have helped make our work possible. We owe a lot to them. And basically, as Professor Franke was saying, there are spaces and places for everyone to get involved. And I think it comes back to that question of utility. When you think about your own work, what is it, how is it that you can utilize what you have at your fingertips to move the needle forward? And every one of us has something at our fingertips. And so thinking about how you plug that into programs that are either working in advocacy or actually working in reparations, but allies as well in the space can make a difference. So every single thing that you are skilled at can be used towards racial justice if you look at it the right way. So anyway, I thank you so much for this. It was wonderful, Sydney.
First of all, thank you all for those answers. And I just want to end by saying I can't thank all three of you enough for being willing to share your time and your research and your wisdom. I had a fantastic time during this conversation, and I'm so grateful to all three of you for being willing to share with us. Before I turn it back over to Beth to close us out, I just wanted to mention that this is part one of our series, and in the next panel, we will be having a conversation with former Alderman Robin Ruth Simmons, City Council President, actually, Vanessa Hall Harper from Tulsa, and former Councilman Keith Young from Asheville, North Carolina, all three of whom have done the work in their city councils and in their local governments to pass reparations resolutions. So really excited to continue this conversation. Thank you so much again to all three of our panelists, and thank you to everyone that took the time this evening to come and join us in this discussion. Have a good night, and I will turn it back over to Beth.
Thank you so much, Sydney. What a wonderful job moderating. If you haven't had a chance to check the chat box, please do. You're getting a lot of love and gratitude for your hard and amazing work, which I would like to echo. I would also love to echo your thanks to the amazing panelists, Dr. Mann, professors Franke and Hansford. What an illuminating conversation. We're so grateful that you took the time to join us. And we're very grateful to you, the audience, for joining us as well. I'd like to give a special shout out to Anna Shearer, who's a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology, and she also teaches at Barnard. She's been an integral part of our work, our little working group with me and Sydney and Anna, planning these reparations panels, and fingers crossed a capstone workshop so we can take all of these percolating ideas and try to put them into action. So we'd like to have a practical element to close out this wonderful series created by Sydney. So again, thank you so much to all of you. I just have to give a quick Holder Initiative plug and let all of you know that we will be hosting a panel on voting rights with Eric Holder, which will be moderated by Jelani Cobb of Columbia Journalism and The New Yorker on voting rights. So that's also a very important conversation, not completely unrelated to the one we're having here tonight. So again, thank you to all of you, and we hope to see all of you again soon. Thank you.